Every year, by law and by custom, we meet here to consider the state of the Union. This year we gather in this chamber deeply aware of decisive days that lie ahead.
Bush presented so many distorted beliefs, estimates, and guesstimates that it appears that he was misleading the public and the Congress.
From 3 Iraqi defectors, we know that Iraq in the late 1990s had several mobile biological weapons labs.
What we were working on before the war was a set of cartoons, of sketches, if you will, of what was said by a defector who probably had his own self-interest at heart and was willing to tell this government whatever he thought would get him the usual $1 million reward and a settlement with new name and a nice house somewhere.
Unfortunately, every reliable source of our own was unable to find anything convincing. So we were dependent on the defectors provided by Mr. Chalabi of the Iraqi National Congress. It's fascinating to see that he has been providing intelligence for many years, and every checkable piece of that intelligence that's come to public notice has proven to be false, or at least self-serving in the extreme.
Saddam Hussein had the materials to produce as much as 500 tons of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agent.
Any sarin that they were making in 1990, 1991 had a known shelf life of about 2 months. I have confirmed this with inspectors and analysts who were deeply involved in the 1990s analyses. Well, if you made it 12 years ago and it had a shelf life of 2 months, it may not be safe to drink, but it isn't sarin nerve gas any longer. And there's no way the agency could not have known that.
U.S. intelligence indicates that Saddam Hussein had upwards of 30,000 munitions capable of delivering chemical agents. Inspectors recently turned up 16 of them, despite Iraq's recent declaration denying their existence.
And then they tried to use the fact that inspectors found 16 of these as evidence that thousands more existed. And again, I mean, it's, as a methodology, it's a very weak way to predict anything. And I think it borders on propaganda to argue that the small number that have been found by inspectors imply that, in this case, over 29,000 exist.
Saddam Hussein has not accounted for the remaining 29,984 of these prohibited munitions.
The Bush administration officials either routinely said or tried to give the impression that if Iraq had not fully accounted for all of a certain item related to chemical or biological weapons, then it must be there. And that's not at all what the inspectors said or found.
He hasn't accounted for that material. He has given no evidence that he has destroyed it.
And the inspectors could go in and say, okay, we can prove, yeah, you destroyed that set in this way or that set in that way, but these others, we can't prove it. And that doesn't mean that they didn't destroy these warheads or whatever the item was. It just means Iraq hadn't been able to prove it.
Saddam Hussein had material sufficient to produce more than 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin, enough to subject millions of people to death by respiratory failure.
The inspectors had evidence to say that Iraq had not fully revealed its biological weapons program, particularly its ability to make botulinum toxin, and therefore it was an open issue. But again, it doesn't mean that what the inspectors found was evidence that Iraq possessed that.
Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production.
I think there was very little doubt that the centrifuge tubes, so-called, were nothing but rocket motor tubes to go into M81 style artillery rockets. They certainly have all the specs for that.
Nuclear experts, for instance, from Lawrence Livermore's Laboratories Z Division, the experts on centrifuge enrichment, came out and said, no, you couldn't enrich uranium using these tubes. They're not compatible.
I saw it as a deliberate attempt to take information and selectively take information and try to basically say Iraq poses an imminent nuclear threat, and therefore action is absolutely necessary. And I felt that was absolutely wrong.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program.
The administration showed photos of nuclear or former nuclear weapon sites in Iraq, pre-1991 nuclear weapon sites, claimed that new construction showed they were ongoing nuclear weapons production sites. Complete nonsense.
Before the war in Iraq, the United Nations inspectors told us that Saddam Hussein did not have nuclear weapons capability. It turns out that's true.
The most troubling thing about the fact of the distortions and the misleading statements that Bush gave Congress is that it is a federal felony. It's a crime to mislead and distort information and present it to the Congress.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
8 days later, when Secretary Powell addressed the UN about weapons of mass destruction, he deliberately left out any reference to attempts to buy uranium from Africa.
I didn't use the uranium at that point because I didn't think that was sufficiently strong as evidence to present before the world.
CIA officials warned members of the president's staff the intelligence was not good enough to make the statement, Iraq tried to buy uranium from Africa.
In October, for the Cincinnati speech, not for the State of the Union, but the Cincinnati speech, George Tenet asked that this be taken out of the Cincinnati speech, the reference to yellow cake. It was taken out of the Cincinnati speech because whenever the Director of Central Intelligence wants something out, it's gone.
How to get back in?
It's not a matter of getting back in. It's a matter, Tim, that 3+ months later, people didn't remember that George Tenet had asked that it be taken out of the Cincinnati speech, and then it was cleared by the agency.